Hi everyone. So today I'd like to look through a game I played. I'm white, and this was versing Noble Falcon. So essentially, this is probably one of the worst games I can remember playing. But there's a good moral of the story, which is remember, I guess, to never give up, regardless of your position. So I start with e4. It's what I know. Essentially, try and take hold of the center. He plays d5 to counter that. I usually develop my knight onto g3. However, this time I developed my knight onto c3. So, not too sure why I did that because I wasn't really prepared if he pushed his pawn forward, where I put the knight. But in hindsight, it's probably good to retreat it to e2. So he actually ended up playing that move. But instead of retreating to e2, I took my knight to I moved my knight to d5. In which case, I already know it's not too great of a position. Um, I'm moving the knight around a bit too much when there's still the whole back rank I need to develop. And he can also put pressure on the knight with tempo by just developing c6 or e6 with his pawn. So yeah, essentially he decided to go with c6. So I retreated my knight. So that's three knight moves um, within my first four moves, which isn't really too much of a good sign if you want to take control of the center of a board. So he continues developing, captures the center. I develop my bishop here onto c4. At this point, I just didn't acknowledge the line of sight that by moving his pawn forward, it essentially was a discovery on my knight. I just didn't quite acknowledge that. So I developed my bishop. He captures the knight. So already down at the start, I've done three opening moves with my knights and then blunted it, which is not a very good start to a game. I developed my c3 pawn whilst putting pressure on his bishop. He retreats his bishop. I try and take back the center. He takes back with his queen. My bishop and pawn are hanging, and there might be a check as well on the king. So I develop the pawn to cover both the bishop and the e3 pawn, e4 pawn. He develops his pawn whilst putting pressure on the bishop. Instead of just retreating the bishop, I decided to move my knight forward to put tempo and to put his queen in to, I guess, to put pressure on his queen. Had he taken the pawn, I would take his knights, and it would be essentially a bishop and a knight for a queen. He decided against this, probably rightly so. So instead, he developed his bishop with check, and then I decided to move my king. The bot recommends that I do move my king to f1. The only option really is to trade, either with the knight, but I was reluctant to trade with the knight because the knight's what's putting pressure on the queen, and it's a pretty deadly square for the queen. So I wanted the knight to stay there, if at all possible. And I was against developing the bishop because, in essence, he could capture, then I could capture back. And I'd still have relative security, even though I'm in my own corner of the board. I could even castle. However, I was pretty reluctant to trade pieces when I'm down material, because the value of material um, is increased at the end of the game. So it's not in. If I want possibility for play, I need my pieces on the board to do that. So instead, I retreated my king. He retreated his queen away from the knight, and I decided to use this opportunity to take e5. once again just blundering that bishop onto c4, completely unnecessary, but I guess it happened. So yeah, I then developed my bishop with tempo onto his queen. Not a bad move. However, it's not really a great move as well. It's pretty clear he could just move his bishop um, to that square. And for him, that's probably better than being on to b4. Yeah, so I trade down bishops, not an ideal move. And now I probably should have taken on to c4. I believe that was the bot's recommendation. However, I push d4, put pressure on his queen. That's being covered by my queen on d1. That is a sub-optimal move, really. I didn't put too much thought into that. So he moves his queen out of the way. And now I can't actually take this pawn on c4 anymore because it's no longer being covered by my d3 pawn. So instead, I develop my queen, really try and get some sort of counterplay set up. It was a very unideal situation because I knew that my king was still on f1, and he could have a discovery had he pushed this pawn forwards. And that could look pretty tricky. I would probably move to e1. He could either take with his queen, or he could take with his pawn. Either way, he has a pretty good opportunity to get another queen, whilst also being able to put pressure on the open rank here, on the first rank. But instead, he reacted to my move, knight to f7, which could have came, or queen to f7. So I essentially wanted to start putting pressure on the middle pawn. I thought he would bring this out, and I could perhaps try and do some maneuvering, try and open up the position a little bit with my queen. I've got a fair bit of space. But instead he took b2. At this point I wanted to start asking questions and to try and maneuver the bishop. I was hoping he would blunder the bishop and take it away from this file. That wasn't the case. He checked me, and then continued to check me. I believe I moved quite optimally with my king. Yeah, so he takes the center, I take his pawn back, put pressure on his bishop. However, there's nothing covering my pawn, so he takes that back. Still covering the f7 square with his bishop. And at this point, I moved my castle to e1. I wanted to essentially have a discovery on his king. And I was hoping that he would see this and play a prophylactic move and move his king out of the way, which could have been devastating. And that's actually what he did. And essentially, it's now a mate in one, where I move the queen from g5 to g8, and that was checkmate. Pretty much out of nowhere. The position really wasn't a very optimal position at all. So yeah, that was the game. I hope to start posting a few of these up onto YouTube. Hopefully, at least a video a day. I think it could be really good to look back on it, to review it, and to try and see the mistakes I have and maybe input that the YouTube community or the chess community has. But yeah, thanks. I hope you enjoy. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, and comment. Cheers.